السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. We begin in the name of Allah, the merciful, the compassionate. May the peace and blessings of God be upon our Prophet Muhammad and all of his brothers from the various prophets and messengers, beginning with Adam and ending with the seal of prophets, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Alhamdulillah, that it is very nice to be here with you all tonight, and there's a very nice and beautiful energy, and that the topic of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the most beautiful of topics, and to speak about the Prophet, that it is of the most joyous things to do. In the very name that we find of the Prophet himself is a very proof of the great traits that he possessed as a prophet, and how God perfected not only his human stature but also in all of the great traits that he gave him, subhanahu wa ta'ala, great and glorious is he, that enabled him to be a conduit to convey the will of God through the divine message. And that his name is Muhammad. And for those who know what his name means, that it comes from an intensive form. In the Arabic language, that you have morphological patterns, and that every word, virtually every word, stems from a trilateral root. And so the name of our Prophet stems from the root is Hamida Yahmidu, which is to praise. But if you add and you double the second letter, and thus you move it to what is known as the second form in Western scholarship, where it becomes Hamada Yuhammidu, it means to praise extensively. Just as the Arabs would say, that if you would say Kasartu Zujaja, that I broke the glass, but if you say that Kasartu Zujaja, that I broke the glass into pieces, that likewise, that this is an emphatic form that indicates that his name Muhammad is the one that is praised. لِكَثْرَةِ خِصَالِهِ الْحَمِيدَةِ, because of all of his great traits. And that without doubt, that it is these traits that have been a source of guidance for Muslims for century upon century, generation after generation, until this very day and age. And so this is a very fitting title, that the man that you wish you knew, because there's metaphysical implications in that statement, in the subtitle of the understanding of the Prophet Muhammad. And if we may at this juncture, there's a whole bunch of things that we would like to speak about tonight, and hopefully we'll be able to weave them together in some type of coherent fashion. And that in recognizing that the idea of an afterlife, a hereafter, that there's certain things in Islam that you cannot understand until you take into the equation and understanding of the afterlife, the hereafter, the two final abodes. And that whether these be points of theology or whether they be points of law, that ultimately Muslims see themselves in this particular world as in a second stage of 5 overall worlds. Is that you have the pre-earthly abode, which began with the creation of the spirit and as it stood before its Lord, which is documented and mentioned in the Quran as Lastu bi Rabbikum, that God spoke to the spirits and said, am I not your Lord? And the spirits affirmed this and said, Qalu Bala, they said, but of course. And there are other Quranic references to what is termed the pre-earthly realm. And then the earthly realm begins for each human being as they enter into the world when their mother gives birth to them, and they enter into this world when they are conceived. And that stems from the very first breath that they take until the very last breath that they take. And that is the second world, which is the one that we're all in now. And then there's a third abode, which is the abode of what is known as the barzakh, the intermediary realm. That it is between this earthly realm in which we live in, and between that the next realm, which is after the intermediary realm, which is the Day of Judgment, or Yawm al-Qiyamah in Arabic. And then ultimately, one of the two final abodes. And so that we believe that there's 5 different worlds, and that we're in the second. And that in understanding the importance of a concept of something that is everlasting, human beings, that we can understand infinity only as a concept. We can't understand its reality. We can't experience infinity with the limitations of our senses and our mind. Infinity, that yes, that we make a symbol and that we know that any number that we put over it, however large that number might be, that it's going to cancel out and it's going to equal 0. We can't experience infinity as a human being. We experience the moment. And that's why that ultimately what we have is the moment. The past is gone. And it's something that is a memory. and there's a way that we deal with the past, yes. But the future is a check that we don't know if we're going to be able to spend. We don't know what's going to happen in the next moment. All we have right now is the present moment. And this is what defines us as human beings. However, that we can, because we've been gifted as children of Adam with something special. We've been given that not only with a aspect of the brain that no other aspect of Allah's creation has been gifted with, the frontal cortex, but we've also been gifted the blessing of language, so that we can understand abstract concepts. What apes and chimpanzees and anything below them in the chain of animals can't understand, is that we can understand the idea of a future, that there is something that is going to come. And in this power of the human being to understand concepts, is that taking into consideration something that is everlasting, is that the reason that this is so important is because that when we come to understand these things, there's a difference between trying to understand something solely with the intellect and some trying to understand something that is experiential by nature. Right? For that very reason, that if something is experiential by nature, is that if you're not experiencing it, you won't be able to understand it. And thus that we have that this idea of an everlasting abode, of eternity, that this is central, and you will see this played out throughout the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and the way that he interacted with the people that are around him, and the way that the teachings that he left behind, that if you take that into consideration, what might have been difficult to understand actually becomes easy. And there's a long list of things that you could mention in that regard. So speaking about Muhammad, the praised one, is a beautiful topic. And there are a number of ways that we can come to know the Prophet. And oftentimes, and this is not just a question that people who are not that subscribe to the faith of Islam ask. Actually, Muslims themselves ask the same question quite often. That wanting to know who is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And one of the reasons is because in the time in which we live, that there's a lot of confusion. And that we see various competing narratives. And that all of these various competing narratives, that they all seem to sanction their behavior and what they're doing with verses of the Quran, with statements of the Prophet Muhammad, with actions of the early people. And thus that it becomes for those who are not grounded in knowing who he is and who he was and who he will be. Because it's not just about knowing who he is, it's about knowing who he was, who he is now in the present, and who he will be in the future. Is that this is one of the great ways that to clear up a lot of this confusion. Because that once you start to know who the Prophet Muhammad is, and you start to know him as the source for all of the details that come later, and all of the individual manifestations that come later, that you will be able to determine, you will have the greatest measure and the greatest criterion for you to be able to come and truly ascertain what are his teachings. One of the greatest ways to know the Prophet Muhammad is to look at the book that he brought. One of the very interesting things about the Quran is that the Prophet Moses is mentioned about 500 times in the Quran. That much more than the Prophet Muhammad. The majority of times that the Prophet Muhammad is mentioned, he's actually mentioned by his various epithets and names that God gives him. But the Prophet Moses is actually mentioned that many more times in the Quran than the Prophet Muhammad. That there is a chapter in the Quran titled Muhammad, but there's also a chapter in the Quran titled Maryam, that chapter on Mary. And that we have 25 prophets that are mentioned explicitly in the book of God, in the Quran, that are required belief. And that one of the very beautiful things about the Prophet Muhammad is that he saw himself coming in a legacy of other prophets. One of his statements is, he said, the likeness of me and the prophets that came before me is the likeness of a building. Is that as this building was built, people started to walk around it and say, what a beautiful building this is. And they noticed that there was one stone that was not, one brick that was yet to be laid in order for that building to become complete. And they say that were only that stone to be laid. And then the Prophet ﷺ said that, Ana tilka labina, that I am that stone. And so he saw himself in using the metaphor of an edifice of the previous prophets that came before him, is that he was the last stone. He was the seal. He came in a long chain of other prophets and messengers. And we see this also in another one of his statements, peace be upon him, where he said that إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِيُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ, that indeed that I have only been sent to perfect good character. Now, part of that relates to the natural disposition of the human being, because that one of the interesting things about Islam is that it's called the Deen al-Fitra, the Deen of the natural disposition, the innate disposition of the human being, meaning that every aspect of Islam, inwardly and outwardly, Iman, Islam, and Ihsan, belief, spirituality, and practice, that there's something about it that it mirrors the human being and only brings out the Adamic potential that exists in every human being. And so that in that we recognize that human beings are naturally disposed to have certain good traits. And so when the Prophet said that I've only been sent to perfect them, meaning that he reaches in and he attaches that particular trait that someone might have, and he ties it to a religious ethos. And in so doing so, that you have the true efficacy of that trait in and of itself. And this is something that we need to be very clear about. For a Muslim, that having good character, it's not looked at in some utilitarian sense. That the whole reason that we have good character is because of solely for what it leads to in society. That's part of the picture. And that's an important part of the picture. However, that it's actually much grander than that. Is that if you look at some of the ethical theorists of Islam, what they say when it comes to these traits of character, that they actually directly correspond to the next world. That each trait that you adopt, that a door opens up between you and drawing near to God. A door of gnosis opens up between you and God based upon the adaptation of that particular trait. And this is one of the meanings that pertains to him perfecting good character. A second is that he recognized is that there were teachings that came before. And that there were people that came before that brought teachings. And that he perfected and completed those various teachings. And so that you have, if you look at another ethical theorist, Hujjat al-Islam, Imam al-Ghazali, that he mentions in his famous celebrated work, Yahya Rhodus, that if you look at his ethical theory, is that you will find sense and traces of the ethical theory of Aristotle. And that you will find in that one of the ways that he reconciles that, is he says in Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, the deliverance from error, that he says is that he felt that even the pre-Socratic, the Socratic philosophers and those that came before them, that they took this knowledge from the wisdom of the prophetic knowledge that was still existent in their particular time. And so that he had an ability, this great scholar, to see that this particular contribution, this intellectual contribution, that it had, if you look at it in its root, and that you take it and you put it into an Islamic context, that it could be used. But this is an example of how this is played out, so that we have that there is a legacy of ethical theories, there's a legacy of good character traits, and that the Prophet came to perfect them. But if we take this back to the Quran, that in relation to character, one of the most celebrated verses about the Prophet Muhammad is that when God says in the Quran, وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ, that indeed that you are upon a vast ethos. And if you go to Medina al-Munawwara, to this day, Medina, the radiant, which is where the Prophet Muhammad is born. And that if you go behind the screen where he's buried, is that you'll see 3 golden gates, and you'll see above that 3 different verses of the Quran that are written. But if you look even in some of the pictures that you have here today, is that you look up to the top right, and that you will see even above the verse of Quran a line of poetry by one of the great inheritors, the great 12th century scholar, Imam al-Haddad, Imam Abdullah bin Ali al-Haddad of Hadramaut, that it says, there's a lines of poetry, it says, Nabiyyun, عظيم خلقه الخلق الذي له عظم الرحمن في سيد الكتب, that a prophet, that whose character is that character which the All-Merciful has magnified in the best of books. And that this is what is known as his epitaph. An epitaph is an inscription that is written upon someone's grave. And oftentimes that if you're going to write an inscription on someone's grave, that you're going to write about that person the very best thing that you could possibly mention. But if you wanted to sum up someone's life of them being great, you would write that on what is called their epitaph. And that this is the epitaph in a sense of the Prophet, even though it's not written directly on his grave. But it's celebrating his character. Now, you could have celebrated a number of things about him. But what is it then about the character that is being celebrated here? Because the character that ties into the overarching nature which makes someone truly human. This is the true measure to determine who we are as human beings. And that there's a very beautiful story about this, where that there was a lady who was known to have fasted during the day and prayed at night. And then when the Prophet was asked about her, because they told him that she used to harm her neighbors with her tongue, the Prophet said, "La khayra fiha." There's actually no good in her. And then gave a statement after that which brought about a great warning about her state and the peril of being in that particular state. But one of the very interesting things is that we live in a time where for many religious people, which is, lest we forget, is the main reason probably why people actually start to disbelieve in anything and become atheists, is because of the acts and hypocrisy of religious people themselves. This is a human problem. This is a universal problem. And that once we recognize is that it is the character, who you are as a human being, which is the definitive measure through which that you can know someone's religiosity or not. And if you think about it in this regard, Iblis, that both Christians and Muslims share a similar understanding to Iblis or Satan, is that there's traditions that point to the fact that Satan that was a great worshipper. And in the Islamic tradition, there's different opinion about whether he was a jinn, a sprite, or whether he was an angel. However, is that most scholars say that he was a sprite. He wasn't from an angel, so he's not considered, according to the majority, a fallen angel. However, is that he was known to be a great worshipper. And in his being a great worshipper, that they say there wasn't a handspan in the heavens except that he worshipped in the heavens. Now, why is the story of Satan so pertinent to our lives? Is because is that here you have the ultimate worshipper and then getting banished. And the meaning that we take from that is that the delusion of the pseudo-religious is actually greater than the delusion that comes from the profligate or the person who is irreligious. And so that this brings an answer to the question that when you see people that doing things in the name of religion, that if God would have willed that He could have made the paragon of evil that be someone who never done good in their entire life. But this is the archetype of evil. The archetype of evil was the one who was actually pseudo-religious, as opposed to the one who wasn't even apparently religious whatsoever. And so this is an important point to recognize. But getting back to the Prophet Muhammad, is that it relates to his character. Because the character is this definitive measure. And if we look at a great story that took place between him and his wife, may the peace and blessings of God be upon him, Aisha, who was a great scholar, and that he said that take half of your religion from this little red woman. This is a way that he used to speak about Humayra, and that this is the way that he used to speak to her in a beautiful way. And that they say that about half of the legal rulings or edicts of Islam have been come to us through Sayyidah Aisha, his great wife. And that she was asked one time that what was the most amazing thing that you've ever seen from the Prophet Muhammad. And for those of you in the room that are married, that if someone came and asked your wife that what was the most amazing thing what was the most amazing thing that she saw about you, what would your wife say about you? If everything was said and done, and someone's like, you have to be honest. I'm asking you about your husband, right? What was the nature of your husband? Right? Because we all know, you take two different people from two totally different backgrounds, that even if they're from the same ethnic background, but still, with the two totally different psychological profiles, put them together and see how they act with one another. And that when all of these different things are there that might lead to a outburst of bad character, and see. It's usually when you start to see the true nature of people and people start to show their true colors. So they asked Sayyidah Aisha, and they asked his wife that what was the most amazing thing that you saw about the Prophet Muhammad? And that Aisha started to weep. And she said that what wasn't amazing about the Prophet Muhammad? The life at home is the most mundane aspect of our existence. Your home life. This is where you take showers. This is where you use the restroom. This is where you eat. That this is where the most normal aspect of things that make us human that are emanating from you. And here that your testimony is that what wasn't amazing about the Prophet Muhammad. But she said that he used to, that after everyone would come home at night, and after everyone would go spend time with those that they would love, she said, and she mentioned in a detailed narration, he says is that the Prophet Muhammad would come next to me, and she said until his skin would touch my skin. She said, and then he would ask me, he would say, that do you permit me to stand in prayer before my Lord? The Prophet Muhammad is not in need of asking anyone for permission to stand in prayer before God. He said that, do you permit me to stand in prayer before my Lord? And she said that, O Messenger of God, she says, I want you to be near me. He said, but that I prefer what you want over what I want. And then she's witnessing this at night, that he's been standing in prayer. And she would describe his prayer, how he stood and how he bowed and how he prostrated. And she said that he would remain like this until that they would call the call to prayer for the dawn prayer. And then when he was asked that why he used to do this, he said, أَفَلَا أَكُونُ عَبْدٍ شُكُورًا, that should I not be a thankful slave? Should I not be a thankful servant of God? This was his way, that the way of remembering God, that the Prophet is described as كَانَ يَذْكُرُ اللَّهَ عَلَى كُلِّ أَحْيَانِهِ, that he used to remember his Lord in all of his different states. That he has a whole series of prophetic invocations that are recited in the morning, that are recited in the evening, from even things such as when you get in your car, your modern day horse or whatever it might be, you put on your clothes, that all these things that you do before you eat, after you eat, that even when you see the new moon, that there's supplications that he left behind in order to open up the door for us to be able to be in a state of our remembrance. So that if you look at the Quran, there's many verses that speak to who he was. And some of these are explicit and others are implicit. And you find the use of pronouns is that every time, almost every time you see in the Quran, قُل, that لَا أَسَلُكُمْ عَلِي أَجْرًا, for instance, say that I ask you for no recompense. That this قُل, which literally you translate as say, that it means say, O Muhammad, Ya Muhammad, say, O Muhammad. That it's in reference to Allah directing this address to him, and then through him, then to his community. Now, that if you trace through various verses of the Quran, which this is not, we're not going to go into more detail about that, and then also that the hadith collection, which are his sayings, and actually not only his sayings, is that they are his sayings, his actions, his traits, and what is known as his taqdirat, which are his tacit approvals. All of that in general is considered the sunnah, or the way of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Another way to come to know him is through his seerah, which is his life story, which, depending upon how you look at it, begins with his birth, and then at the age of finishing 40 years, receiving prophecy, and then returning to God at the age of 63. That this is another way to come to know him. That another way to come to know him is through what is called his shama'il, which are the prophetic characteristics, which is the literature that focuses on his physical description. We have a precise, exact physical description of how the Prophet, peace be upon him, looked. From the ways that his eyes looked, the ways that his eyebrows looked, the shape of his face, the color of his skin, the nature of his hair, it being slightly wavy, and that how his beard looked, and even to the extent of counting the number of gray hairs in his beard, and then describing in detail his chest and in his stomach, and where he even had hair on his chest, peace be upon him. A very detailed description, and moving on as well into his character, and all of the traits that he embodied. And there was whole books compiled about this particular subject. And then you even have another way, which is a more of a spiritual way to know the Prophet, which is known as what is the salawat literature. Is that you find companions of the Messenger of Allah himself, as well as throughout the generations, that people composing various sigh, or forms of salawat, of prayer upon the Prophet Muhammad, which points to some of his reality, some of his aspects that he was given by his Lord. Now, but if you look at all of that, and that you understand what took place in that first generation, because the Prophet was born in Mecca al-Mukarramah, in Mecca, in the Arabian Peninsula, and that the Arabian Peninsula at that time was a very geographically insignificant place. Right? Yes, that there was the Kaaba, and it was significant amongst the Arabs primarily. The Kaaba was significant. but in the state of the geopolitics of the time, that the Arabian Peninsula was not a place that was the most desirable of places. That they mentioned when Alexander the Great came to the Arabian Peninsula, he just turned back and left because he saw a vast desert. And one of the interesting things about the Arabian Peninsula is that, well, what Muslims would consider the geographical miracle of the Arabian Peninsula is that all of the criterion for the preservation of language were present. And such that the same Arabic that we're speaking nowadays, to this very day, with the exact pronunciation, with the exact makharij of the huruf, which are the points of articulation, which is still taught and passed down with what is known as an ijaza or a license, generation after generation, such that of all of the 28 Arabic letters, that we know exactly and perfectly the way that they are uttered. Now, this is very different to many other sacred languages that you have, like Hebrew, or that you have like Latin, is that these are known as what are called dead languages, meaning that they cease to be spoken at a particular juncture, and even though that we have written proofs of them, that we don't know exactly the way that they were pronounced. That the Hebrew of today was definitely not the Hebrew of Moses, that's for sure. What exact way did they used to pronounce it, that's hard to determine. But the Hebrew is an inflected language like Arabic. The Arabic has an a-i-u diacritical mark, a vowing, that gives it a particular sound that helps determine its grammar. The Hebrew is similar to that, and that they have their own symbols and diacritical marks for those. However, is that all of what needed to be there to preserve the Arabic language, that was there. And that the Arabic language was spoken in a pristine form for thousands of years, and the golden age of it was just before the Prophet was born. Now, one of the other interesting things about the Arabian Peninsula was that it was very difficult to access. Not only the vast desert to the north, but also you have the Red Sea to the west. And the coral reefs of the Red Sea, where it's very shallow, make it very difficult to even dock a boat, to even access. Likewise, from the Persian or Arabian Gulf, depending upon how you look at it, it was difficult to access from the east. And then you have to the south a mountain range along with the Arabian Sea, which turns into the Indian Ocean. And then that even if you get up on land, that you have what is called the Rub al-Khali, which is the empty quarter, which is one of the most desolate places on earth. And that you wouldn't think that this would in and of itself be the choice place for a universal religion. But this was the place that God chose for the Prophet to be born, in al-Qura, Mecca, which you could translate as the embryonic city. And so in and of itself is that you have something that appears to be a bit paradoxical, but in that is a great wisdom in the least worldly or cosmopolitan places that God that made the universal prophet. And so the Prophet was simultaneously a prophet to the Arabs who were around him, but also he was a prophet to all of humankind. And one of the verses that you heard quoted from the Qari, may Allah reward him, was the verse that says, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ, and that we have not sent you except as a mercy to all of the worlds. Now, we're going to get back to this point here about the worlds and about the significance of prophetic knowledge. But before I do that, I want to finish up this other preliminary discussion. That if you look at the Arabian Peninsula at that time, one of the very interesting things was that the Arabs were very strategically positioned from BC times along the trade routes of the Indian Ocean. Is that they are positioned not only in Arabia, they are positioned in East Africa, they are positioned in southern India, they are positioned in eastern China, and they are positioned all through the Malay archipelago. Malaysia, Singapore, modern-day Singapore, and Indonesia. And that this is why that the spread of Islam to southern India is very different than the spread of Islam to northern India. The spread of Islam to East Africa is very different than the spread of Islam to North Africa. The spread of Islam to Southeast Asia is very different than the spread of Islam to Central Asia. And because of the existence of these trade routes, such that you find mosques being built in eastern China, in Canton, China, within 200 years of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Because that as the Arabian Peninsula converted to Islam, which they did, within 1 century after the return of the Prophet Muhammad to God, is that along these trade routes, Islam spread very rapidly. Now, one of the other very interesting things is that Islam was privileged from an early stage to be exposed to the major civilizations of the earth in a very short period of time, such that you see an explosion outside of the Arabian Peninsula. Within 100 to 120 years, Muslims were knocking on the door of southern France, and at the same time that they had reached that western China. And in that they were exposed to the Egyptian civilization, the Eastern Byzantine civilization. They were exposed to the various tribal religions of northern Africa. That they were exposed to the Persian civilization. They were exposed to the Greek civilization through the Eastern Byzantine. And then eventually they were exposed to the Indian civilization. And then eventually the Chinese civilization. And then a few centuries later, the Malay civilization. Which is not including North and South America, which as a whole story in of itself, that some of the world's major civilizations. The cradle of civilization, as we all know, is Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. That even when you take a history class on the history of Western civilization, that's where it starts. Is there. Now, that where was the first man from, that's a whole story in of itself. That there's theories posed in anthropology. Religious people might have their own take on that. The point here is that Muslims were exposed to some of the great world civilizations, and most of the great world civilizations, at a very early stage, which led to something that was very interesting. It tied into this alamiyah, this universal understanding that the Prophet Muhammad had embedded into his companions. Because that, from the Muslim perspective, is that the Prophet Muhammad is the only universal prophet. He was a universal prophet. And that Muslims believe that the Prophet Jesus was sent as a Messiah, yes, but to the tribe of Israel. He was a prophet sent to the Jews. Anyhow, that in that regard is that you saw for the next several centuries an incredible project take place, which would define that Islam as a civilization for the centuries after that, the remnants of which still can be studied and looked at to this day by way of inspiration, although that much of the traditional Muslim heritage has been dismantled that in the past several hundred years, but the traces of which still exist about what took place. Islam did not deny outright all of the great contributions of these great civilizations of the past. Is that what took place was a great, massive, to speak about these things in an oversimplified way, translation project and synthesis project of looking into these various cultural heritages and taking from them and then that understanding them and reappropriating them in a context of what is called tawheed, or belief in the divine unity of God. And thus that we have one of the great statements of the Prophet is that he says that al-hikmatul dalatul mu'min, that wisdom is the lost property of the believer. But if you look at the words, is what he's saying here, al-dalla is literally something that you lose. Now it specifically refers to like a sheep or a goat that a desert Arab loses, but it means any possession that you lose. But the point here is that as individual pieces of information, that wisdom of the ancients, if you will, that piece of wisdom, when it is reappropriated into a worldview of belief in the divine unity of God, is that the true efficacy of that individual piece of wisdom in the way that it could benefit humanity will be maximized. And so that this is very interesting. If you compare the history of Islam to the history of Christendom, that even though that Christendom did reach parts of Central Asia, but for most of its history, that it was landlocked by Muslims. That from the east and from the south in particular, the Mediterranean Sea was the first place where this played out between the Christendom and between the Islamic state, if you will. And that one of the great stories, and really tragic stories from a Muslim perspective, is that Andalusia, that Muslim Spain and Portugal, and all the history which took place, which that us being here right now, that oftentimes that we don't really think about this because it's not really mentioned in that way in the history books. if you read a book by Marshall Hodgson called Rethinking History, is that you will find is that the significant part of one of the most significant parts of European history, that it was tied hand in hand with Muslim history. That the same year that Columbus supposedly left Spain to come to this part of the New World was in 1492. That was the same year of the fall of Granada. Right? It went hand in hand with the expulsion of Muslims in the Spanish Inquisition. And that the whole search of the Dutch to find a way around the Horn of Africa in order to be able to have direct access to the spices of India and the silks of China and porcelain and all these other types of things, is that there was a concerted effort to do this because Muslims dominated the Silk Route. They dominated trade in the Indian Ocean. And that when that happened, is that it had devastating consequences to the economy within the Islamic State. Anyhow, that if we look at all of this, is that one of the central themes of the Prophet, which you can really come to learn when you read all of these various sources that I mentioned to come to know him, is his universality. And that even if you look in this room today, is that we see quite a bit of diversity. That people coming from literally places from all over the earth. And that, unfortunately, that now I guess it's getting better, but Americans aren't known to be the most widely traveled people. I'm talking about Americans that were born and raised here, and that might have, had the experience of having a family that's been here for some time. That only till recent times that actually a very small percentage of Americans even have a passport. And if they have a passport, the majority of them have only gone to Mexico or Canada or maybe the Caribbean. And that to not know that what is really taking place in other parts of the world, and the fact that you have large numbers of Muslims in places like Russia, that you have large numbers of Muslims in Eastern Europe that are wider than me, and that's pretty hard. And that you have large numbers of Muslims in China, that maybe up to 100 million, is that it's really interesting to see the diversity of Islam in North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, East Africa, getting into Eastern Europe, going into places like Bosnia, that going to places like Dagestan and Chechnya, when you get into the furthest reaches of Eastern Europe, is that you have significant numbers of Muslims. But it's tied into this universality, and that the Quran begins after Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the Most Compassionate, with Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, that all praise be to God, the Lord of the worlds. And then taking it back to that verse that we heard recited to us, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ, that we have not sent you except as a mercy to all of the worlds. What are all of the worlds? What are all of the worlds? And that this remaining 10 minutes will end on this point. That all of the worlds, that this is why, from a Muslim perspective, God sent prophets. Because that in order for us to know the true fabric of reality, this is the most fundamental desire of the human being, is to know. Every human being wants to know. But in order for us to know, how do we know the true nature of things? How do we know what is true? How do we know that what actually really exists? And especially if there is other abodes, if there is other dimensions. How do we understand things if 95% of the world is dark matter? Right? What is dark matter? Well, it's something that we can detect exists, but we don't know what it actually is. Now, science is going to continue to unveil for us some aspect of this reality. But in terms of the observable aspect of the universe, it's very small. And what we can actually observe, this is where we observe from our perspective the sun going around us and not the opposite. Now we know actually we're rotating around the sun, orbiting the sun, but experientially that it's the sun that is orbiting around us. Experientially that we do see the same thing with the moon. Now, that if you look though, that to what we've now been able to access through the microscope and through the telescope, and what we've been able to that postulate exists from mathematical calculations in very complicated equations that no one understands except the one who's devising it, in that All of that, though, that it's still within what is termed the Sama' Dunya, the terrestrial heaven. So just to put this into perspective, that let's say that string theory actually turns out to be true, and there is 11, maybe up to 21 different dimensions, some of them within 1 millimeter of us that we're not even able to perceive. Let's say that is true. What are these dimensions? Now, if you look back at this verse, one of the great commentators, Wahab ibn Munabbih, that he said that the alameen, the worlds, that God has created 18,000 worlds. This abode and the hereafter only 2. What are the other 17,998? That the distance from here to the sun is 93 million miles. That's a long ways. That the moon itself, the radius of its orbit is about 240,000 miles. And that's why that for those who read Time magazine a couple weeks ago, that asteroid that was coming towards us, which scared so many people, that it flew within the orbit of our furthest orbiting satellites, which is about 24,000 miles. That it flew within that orbit. And that how far of these distances are we talking about, though? Well, let's take it to the edge of our solar system, to Pluto. Let's take it beyond that to the edge of the Milky Way galaxy, and we know that there's 100 billion other galaxies like the Milky Way. And let's even go beyond that, where now scientists are talking about the other 100 billion universes that might exist like our universe. Is that we're talking about something that is entirely expansive and mind-blowing. That from here you can only somewhat just relate to through some type of concept like infinity. Right? Even though we don't say we don't say it's infinite, we possibly believe that it's expanding, but the point is that you're dealing with a massive amount of territory and space and distance here. And that what is the true nature of it? How that we are even finding nowadays that black holes that are 100 billion light years in diameter. That how could you just not see that? I mean, these things are so massive, and God's creation is so massive, which for us, that although it caused problems in Christianity, for Muslims it never was a problem. Because that we don't see, in this whole idea that if the world really is 14 to 16 billion years old, and that we recognize that as human beings that we've only been here for how many thousands of years, if someone looks at it in that perspective, it seems like we're just some blip in some long history of the evolution of the world. That now God created his universe in stages, and that there were stages that led up to the crown of his creation, which is the human being, the sentient human being, which for Muslims is not great because of what was known in traditional Christianity as the great chain of being, which was predicated upon believing that the earth was the center of the world, and the center of the universe, and the center of the cosmos, and that there was various relations then that humans had to God because of that. That Muslims that weren't trapped into that worldview. And in fact, that the greatness of the human being that relates not to in any spatial way, it relates to the greatness of their consciousness, of their ability to know God in a spiritual manner or by way of meaning, not in any spatial way, which is a very important thing. But if we tie this into this idea of universality, is that it is precisely because of this that all of that we just mentioned, everything that's in the Sama' Dunya, and everything that the terrestrial heaven, everything that science will ever come to ultimately detect, all of that from a religious perspective is like a ring thrown in a vast desert compared to the first heaven. And then exponentially, that the terrestrial heaven with the first heaven compared to the second heaven is like a ring thrown in the vast desert, all the way up until you get into the seventh heaven. And then God says in the Quran, وَسِعَ كُرْسِيُّهُ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, his throne, his footstool rather, that it encompasses everything that's in the heavens and the earth. And then we have a tradition that states that the footstool rather compared to the throne is like a ring thrown in a vast desert. Meaning that you're dealing with things that are incomprehensible, and thus precisely the reason that God sent us prophets. And in his sending of prophets, that it was in order to give us the correct way to view that these aspects of God's creation that we can't know, the aspects of God's creations that we might come to know better the more and more that we progress as human beings, but ultimately it's to position us and orient us in that way in order that we may fulfill the goal for which we were created. And that this, to me, as a Muslim, of someone who accepted this faith, is the greatest thing about the religion of the Prophet Muhammad, is that it is a religion that ties you back into who we are as human beings. It reconnects you with what already exists within you. And every single human being has within what is called the sirr al-nafkha, the secret of the blowing of the ruh, through which that we become sacred and that we become special. And that we're able to then, that if we put in the effort, unlock our human capacity, and that as we unlock our human capacity, that one starts to feel an exhilaration that is beyond the ability to express in words, and that this is something that took place with prophetic history in general, and then in particular in the time of the Prophet Muhammad and the legacy left behind of his companions, and then has been transmitted to this very day and age, such that here we are, that over 1400 years after the Prophet Muhammad, discussing these great meanings. And I will end by saying that we are in a particular juncture of history where, and this is an address to the Muslims that are present here, which are the majority. I actually thought that I was going to be speaking to a very different crowd than the one that is here tonight. But this is cause for a reflection for us as Muslims, that as Muslims here in the United States of America at this particular juncture, that it's very important for us to be able to understand that the way things are in the United States, this didn't come out of a void. There's a history to this country. There's a history that led to the Revolutionary War and America breaking off from England. That even before that, George Washington himself fought with England against France, and that all of the wars that took place in Europe the hundreds of years before that in a long, drawn-out history. But there's a history to this particular place that we're in. And that there is a history that is starting to develop, especially now that the numbers of Muslims are significant. I mean, look how many young Muslims that attend this college alone, that live in Chicago, that are in now in the 22 or 300 mosques that we have in the large developing Muslim community in the United States of America, that may be from up to 10 million people. That we're at a particular juncture. And it's very important for us, one, that we recognize is that we don't have to feel alienated being here as Muslims. Is that there is no monolithic definition of an American identity, of what it means to be American, first of all. Second of all, even though the Islamophobes and their $42 million funding that they received in 2012 that are trying to create a rhetoric of hatred, that it's very important for us is that we look beyond that. And it's beyond these dichotomies that are trying to be created, that really is that there are amazing things that Muslims can contribute. And that this is why it's so important for us, though, to be in touch with our tradition and the generation after generation and century after century of civilizational contributions that we've made. The greatest of which is that realigning the human being and teaching people how to live correctly. Is that people have forgotten how to live. That we live lives of mutants. And you can say that, and it's not just because I'm from California and have, been teaching in Berkeley. Right? This is very real. Is that people have lost a sense of their fitrah. If you compare the generation of my grandfather, who died at the age of 100, to the generation of my mother, to my generation, to the new generation that is now here, and you see the differences in the way that they conduct themselves and that the culture that they hold on to, it is rapidly decreasing. There's an extreme decadence that is taking place. With all of the technological prowess and all of the other things that still, in people's minds, keep America on top, that's one aspect. But is that people have forgotten how to live. And of all of the dimensions of health, if you want to divide them into 6 dimensions, the most important dimension of health is the dimension of the religious and spiritual state of the human being. And to be able to have an organic organism that is still alive to reorient you back to these primordial truths is one of the greatest blessings of all. And so that we have to reconnect to that and reattach to that in hopes that we will then be able to produce great fruit. تُؤْتِي أُكُلَهَا كُلَّ حِينٍ بِإِذْنِ رَبِّهَا, that gives its produce at every season by the leave of its Lord, as is mentioned in the Quran. جزاكم الله خير وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.